So let's go ahead and get started. Welcome, everybody. My name is Kurt Pankow. I will be moderating this discussion, and this is Offshoot Stories Exploring the Art of Narrative Design. Narrative design is a broad term that can cover a range of writing, from video games to tabletop RPGs to board games. This panel will discuss different approaches to narrative design, as well as the skills required to be a narrative designer. I am joined by three fantastic panelists, and we are going to go around the horn and just introduce everybody. So, real quick, we'll start with Diego.
Hi, everybody. My name is Diego Rodriguez. I'm a Peruvian psychologist, game designer, and writer. And I've mostly worked I work in video games, and pretty much every single game I make is very different, one from the other. So there's a lot of challenges and a lot of learning through the years, especially through narrative design. And yeah, that's it.
Okay, thank you. Caitlin.
I'm going to go really fast because I think my cat just decided it is litter box time. Um, so my name is Caitlin Starling. I am primarily actually a novelist, but I have dabbled in narrative design. So I am definitely the baby of the panel. Where I have done that, aside from, you know, daydreams that I haven't really taken to fruition anywhere, is I was the narrative designer for actually an interactive theatrical space in New York back in 2018 called A Human, which was essentially a art show pseudo store where you could come in to shop for various fanciful body modifications with interactive staff and a general narrative flow to the space, but without a concrete plot, so to speak. So I learned a lot from doing that. I had a lot of fun doing it. And so now I'm just sort of in grabby hands about everything else.
And Tenacity.
Sounds like an amazing store. I'm in Brooklyn. Is it still a thing?
No, it was only up for maybe a month, right during Fashion Week. We may have made some miscalculations in terms of what we were willing to budget.
Oh,
but,
yeah, I think I'm more of a baby than I'm working on my first Twine game right now, and I'm working on a fan-made sequel to Night in the Woods, if anybody here has played that game. Primarily, I went to film school. I made a film that went to some festivals a while ago, and I'm working on a documentary and also a short story writer. I think that's it.
Okay, well, welcome everyone. For people watching, we are in the Toast channel, Discord channel, so if you have questions, feel free to drop them there, or in the chat here. I will try to keep an eye on both. And so my first question is going to be, what is exciting about narrative design to you? And we'll start with Caitlin.
So the thing that makes me want to do more narrative design and made me very excited for that project that I got to do was the idea of telling a story by experience rather than just telling you the series of events. Sort of allowing a non-linear exploration of not only a narrative of a kind, but also just the setting and the world. Still I am a big fan of a thing in New York, a show called Sleep No More, which, if you've not heard about it, is a immersive version of Macbeth, kind of, with some Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier thrown in there for good measure. And it is told in the form of a 5-story set in a converted warehouse where the audience members all wear masks, cannot speak. The actors also do not speak. And you can explore everything at will. You can follow the characters if you want to try and keep up with the story. You can just pull open drawers and go through them and learn from the environmental storytelling that they've done there. And it loops, if you get in at the beginning of each showing, it loops 3 times. So it is, I don't know, I have some friends who have gone many times who still haven't seen every single scene that happens in a night. And so that's that, and growing up on a steady diet of video games really, caught my imagination and attention of like, okay, how else can you tell a story besides just a linear narrative?
Tenacity, same question.
Yeah, it excites me because it's kind of like quantum storytelling. Like you're not just telling one story, you're kind of like telling all possible stories between like the interval of beginning and end. I love kind of like the complexity of that. I've always loved time travel stories, and I feel like kind of exploring possibility in that way sort of like scratches the same itch. Um, and I just love, just sinking myself into like incredibly complex projects that will be a huge headache to finish, but then, I'm in it now. So like sadomasochistic, I guess.
Diego, how about you?
Well, for me, I love stories. I love to consume them, to analyze them, and tell them, and also play them. I've been playing video games since I was very, very small, and that pretty much uh, that made me that was like the influence for me for becoming a game designer, but also to be a writer. And I've been working a bit on short stories and novels outside of games. So when I went into games, I basically like tried my hands in the whole player experience and trying to design a game that actually takes into account what the player decides to do. And that was actually, for me, it was fascinating because you could actually see, like, you could plan for a lot of things, but ultimately the player would take their own path and surprise you. And that was like very, very interesting for me. Um, but also because um, since my focus is game design, I mainly know more about that. But as I've been dabbling more and more in narrative design, I can see how the story and how the game um, what's the word, like complement each other to make like a bigger product and a more fun experience as well.
Excellent. I'd like to talk a little bit more about that, about the way that the narrative interacts with the mechanics of either an immersive show or a twine game or some other type of game. How does the form affect the narrative? How does the narrative impact the form? Tenacity, how about you go first with this one?
For sure. Well, I guess the way narrative is designed in a game is almost the same as with any medium, which is like that there are a set kind of list of rules that both the game designer and the game reader experiencer play by, and that kind of like limits what can happen within the narrative. For instance, I'm making a twine game right now where the rules kind of like change at 5 different intervals during the narrative, and it's kind of about how does it change the character's ability to affect their environment and make choices like about themselves too.
Diego, same question.
Yeah, well, for me, in my experience, I've had I've been very lucky because I've worked as a game designer and as a narrative designer at the same time. So I can actually plan for the game to have certain mechanics and that can complement each other with a narrative side of things. So it's basically they go basically hand in hand. Like you have to take into account the design and every single mechanic and system of your game, and all those things have to be contextualized inside a narrative. So for your story to work, the same thing with a narrative. You have to ideally you have to plan for a story that actually tells itself through the mechanics as well as through other kinds of systems. So yeah, I would say like they have to be very, very, um, both of them have to work together all the time or most of the time.
What about you, Caitlin? Since if you're immersive plays is a somewhat different, so I'm curious what your take is.
Yeah, so the thing that I always come back to, and it's the thing that I find very challenging but also very engaging, is it's kind of an ongoing conversation of trying to anticipate what your audience is going to try to do, is going to want to try to do, and also guiding them to do the things that you think that your space is created for. Um, so that by your set design, by your world building, by the way that you welcome people into the space, you are trying to set their expectations and also start governing which of several possibilities they're more likely to choose. But you have to know, you can't just assume that you're going to be successful at that. So you also need to have ways to sort of pen them back in if you need to, or yes and them, so that they can engage in the world in a way that maybe you didn't fully plan for. That's the fun thing of doing a live thing, because you can, if you have the right actors and you've given them the right base material, they can run with certain things to engage with a individual attendee or player in the way that they want to engage in the space. But of course, there's the limitations of some people just want to make a mess and screw things up, and then you also need security. But hopefully you can pre-manage that by the way in which you're introducing them to the space, the way in which you're telling them the story. And I think on that level, it is very similar to running like a tabletop game at home, or I guess running a tabletop game for people of collaborative storytelling. And my main experience on that end is playing a game called Dread, which is a horror tabletop game where the only mechanic is questionnaires to determine characters and a Jenga tower. And the Jenga tower enforces a certain playstyle on most players, because the premise is essentially whenever your character would have trouble taking an action because they're afraid, because they don't have the skill, because of whatever else, the player has to take a pull from the Jenga tower if they want to complete that action or attempt that action. They don't have to do it. So if they don't pull from the tower, their character can't die or go crazy or be eaten by a space monster or whatever else. Nothing game-endingly terrible can happen. So there's a fallback that they can take. But if they pull the Jenga tower, pull the brick successfully, they succeed at whatever they're trying to do. And if they knock over the tower, their character is removed from play in whatever way suits the narrative. And so for most players, the physical anxiety of eyeing this teetering tower and having to interact with it starts dovetailing with the anxiety of the narrative that you're telling them and that you're immersing them into, and it gets into a feedback loop. So as the game goes on, the tower gets more precarious and people's skills start to decrease of how dexterous they are, because their hands are shaking, because they're not breathing as evenly as they were before. But then you have certain players, my spouse among them, who doesn't have that reaction, and he can just kind of metagame the whole thing of, he doesn't get nervous from the storyline, and he doesn't get nervous from the tower getting precarious. And so suddenly he has higher skills than all the other players. And that is a thing that you sort of, we've corrected for it, is, it also just isn't very fun for him, so he doesn't really play. But you can also adjust for that by tailoring, if you get used to playing with this person, finding what does trigger that response in them, just to get them back immersed into the mechanics.
Excellent. The next question I would ask is, once you got started with whatever types of narratives you were designing, what are the challenges that you encountered, and were there any challenges that you were particularly surprised by? And let's start with Diego.
Let me think. Maybe well, when working with a story that has like branches, like branching narrative, for me it was always like in my experience, I always told stories like very linearly, very through short stories or novels. So going into a game and having to write a story with different paths, for me it was very difficult, because I had a story that I wanted to tell, but I also had to allow for players to create their own story, or have their own experience within that story. So my biggest challenge was basically that, like finding ways to make the story like flexible enough for players to explore different paths, and make each of those paths interesting enough or impactful enough for the players to actually feel that they are doing something within it, like their actions really have consequences, and still have like the whole story that I want to tell, and for it to have a meaning, and for it to have some sense of some logic.
Same question, Caitlin.
I think that I was wildly ambitious on that store project of what I could communicate in a limited space that had to do other things aside from just tell a story. So I was dealing also with, okay, this is kind of technically an Instagram space sort of thing. And also in our case, like, okay, this is about a place to buy essentially body parts, but we don't want it to be horror. Part of why they brought me on is because I'm a horror writer, so I think the idea was I could tell when we were slipping over into horror more than not. But sort of figuring out what you can do and what you can do reasonably with the scope and budget and timeline that you've been given if you're not working for yourself, or even if you are working for yourself but you want to be done by a certain point in time. I also for a while was working on something for Choice of Games before I realized I had come up with something far too extensive for me to actually, like, the amount of time it would take to pull it off was not the amount of time I wanted to give that project. And so for me, it's been finding, like, what is the reasonable balance point between what I can imagine and what I can actually pull off.
What about you, Tenacity?
I think a coding challenge came up for me when in my Twine game. You can think about a Twine game as being like a decision tree where there's like just kind of many branches to a narrative, but then I found it more useful to kind of make a card for each physical location in the game and kind of like create fuck tons of conditionals to kind of like modify what the character sees in that location based on like how they've affected that environment before. It's kind of like my attempt to make like an open world text adventure.
Awesome. I just gonna throw out real quick that I am keeping an eye on the chat and the Discord. So if people have things that they're curious about, by all means, drop them there, and I will try to work them in. And in the meantime, the next question I would ask is if there's types of stories that are particularly well suited for your medium or particularly poorly suited. And let's start with Caitlin.
Gosh, I'm biased. I think honestly, probably horror is easier to do because you have a very specific type of emotion you're trying to evoke, and you have fairly well-known tools to do that with. It's a genre where people have expectations and experience, and it may not be necessarily easy to do well, but it has some really great there's some really great opportunities with immersive fiction and stuff for horror. Actually, when Tanasi was talking a couple questions back, Doki Doki Literature Club came to mind in terms of a game that changes the rules on you and forces you to engage with the game in a way that you may not have been anticipating. For anyone who has not encountered it in the wild, it looks like it's a dating sim. It is in fact a horror game. It does say that in big letters on the Steam page, but it is possible still to miss that somehow. And if you are not expecting what you're going to, even if you know going in it's a horror game, you still don't know what you're going to get out of it. But if you don't know it's a horror game, it's a bit of a shock when you get to the end of the first round.
I think it's my wish list, so I'll like just put that to the front of the queue there. Then
it is very good, and I think the original version might even be free. I think, or if you're playing on a computer, it might still be free. Whereas I think Switch you have to pay for. Anyway, but horror it's again not easy. It's also easier to hurt people with horror in narrative design, especially in in-person things, where you can't just quietly X out of the program and walk away, where you actually have to deal with the social forces of being with performers or with other players at the table or something like that. But it does lend itself well to worlds that put I always think of narrative design as things that really actually like center you as the person experiencing the story in some way, in some level of immersion.
Tenacity, same question. Are there types of stories that are or are not particularly well suited for the kind of narratives that you design?
I think with Twine, anything involving conversation is really difficult to make immersive, because like with a conversation it's pretty easy to like know that the game isn't really responding to you in an organic way, and the amount of cards you have to write to really create an illusion of a responsive conversation is like pretty nuts. I've actually I work in tech, and I've written some chat bots to like kind of like create an illusion of conversation, and it's pretty difficult. I would only really do that if I was getting paid. I like dialogue in most other like medium forms, but I think like for Twine, it's really hard.
Diego, what about you?
Yeah, I would actually second that. For me, I believe dialogue, when you have dialogue and you don't have a voice actor like saying that dialogue, it kind of it goes against the game because you have a lot of text and the player has to read it instead of read it at the same time as they hear it or just hear it. But also more so than that, I don't know if there's like one thing in particular that can be done in games. Um, there probably is. I actually don't know, but the other side of the coin, the things that video games bring to the table, I believe, for narratives, it's the fact that they actually can make you feel inside the game or inside the story and actually feel like you are the protagonist of that story. So I believe that the interactivity factor is like the key in video games. So for every story you want to tell, especially in video games, you're going to have that advantage because you can actually um, have a player feeling as the protagonist. So I remember this anecdote where someone said like, imagine yourself in a car in a game. Um, you're playing with a character in the game, and the character is driving that car. And if that car crashes, you don't say my character crashed. You say I was the one that got into the crash. So it's hard to explain, but you actually put yourself inside the game. So yeah, I would say that interactivity is like the key focus in games.
To jump on the dialogue thing, I think Skyrim is a good example of the comedy that can come out of like kind of janky dialogue design. Like everybody like in the entire game yells the exact same thing running into battle, no matter what their faction or whatever, and it's like just like 5 different lines that all of them have. It's, yeah, if you haven't played it, it's the time.
Nice. Yeah, someone posted the free version of Doki Doki Literature Club, which I would also second. It is bonkers. And yes, definitely mind the trigger warnings on that. Um, I mean, another one that leaps to my mind is the Stanley Parable of a game that takes the medium and does interesting things with it that you couldn't in a straightforward narrative. We have a question in the chat that just got away from me. There it is. Nope, I was wrong. What do you think of fanfic TTRPG games? This is from Buffalo Sean. I believe we are on Tenacity. How about you take this one first?
By fanfic, like kind of like creating an RPG within like an established world, like a Lord of the Rings version of Dungeons and Dragons. I mean, that'd be fun. In fourth grade, I remember my fourth grade class used to play tag, where the only difference would be that we would LARP as Lord of the Rings characters. We called it Lord of the Rings tag.
And yes, there's a. Oh
Mhm.
no, that was Caitlin following up with a question. But yeah, let's assume that that was what they meant.
Mhm.
Something that takes place in an existing property or existing setting.
I mean, I write fan fiction like all the time. It's like kind of how I cut my teeth down writing, which I'm sure like many other queer internet gremlins had the same experience. So I mean, yeah, doing that collaboratively with friends, very cool.
Diego, do you have thoughts on fanfic, tabletop RPGs, or games?
Actually, I know very little about it. I don't usually follow fanfic, but yeah, in general, fan fiction or fan art or every single content that fans create based on a game, I totally support it, and I basically love it when I see it from our games. So yeah, for me, if somebody like created a fanfic game or story from a game we made, it would be awesome.
Caitlin, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I think it gets to do something really fun in how much it can take advantage of what the players already know and what they bring to the story and how they expect the story to go. That either means that you don't have to do quite as much setup. You can just, as long as you hit the things and you don't contradict anything, people have already, your players, your audience has already immersed themselves in the world enough because they're picking it up because they already love the world. So let's get going. And it allows you to start playing with expectations and subverting them. Like now I'm imagining, what if you did a Lord of the Rings Twine game, but it's a horror game? Like what does that look like? And how can you really set, what is the path to surprising but also satisfying a longtime fan by doing something that is, genre adjacent. That's I also grew up, and still do write fan fiction, and it's really fun to take something and then keep it recognizable, but also now it's a new genre. I love doing that kind of thing. So that seems like a great opportunity.
Very cool. Also from the chat, this is less of a question, more of an anthem. Queer internet gremlins who write fanfic unite. So just throwing that out there. Um, what about replayability, or I guess in the case of a stage production, rewatchability? I mean, Caitlin, you specifically mentioned that people would go to the Macbeth um, show multiple times and still miss things. So how do you factor that in when you're working on a project? And is that something that looms very large, uh, or um, or not? So let's start this one with Diego.
For me, I always think about replayability. For example, we have this game called Arrock, which is just a 30-minute game, and it's actually completely linear. There's like no branching dialogue. There's actually no dialogue at all. Um, but it's a very metaphorical story. So the thing with this game is that you can play it one time, two times, whichever times, and you can always get something different from it because the story that we tell there is like it's not very concrete, so people can get several different things from it. And that was kind of our point when we said, okay, let's make it very short, so players can play it a lot of times. And that's like one example. But then in my experience with mobile games, for example, it's very necessary to actually have a lot of mechanics or a lot of systems that help to for players to come back to it and play again. Not so much the story there, but and maybe I could use another example, which is Tunche, which is a roguelike game. And in this one, we actually expect players to die along the way several times. So there's a lot of replayability there. And that brings actually more challenges than advantages, I would think, because the story has to be broken down in several different pieces and then told in a specific way. So if a player wins the game in a single run, they get a part of the story, but then have to play again to obtain all the other pieces. And the same with someone that dies a lot.
Tenacity.
Yeah, tons of thoughts on this one. But to start with Caitlin's question, my current Twine game has like a bunch of characters that you can play as. So like you're never supposed to see the whole story like on one playthrough. It's kind of like got it built in. Like you won't really understand the world building until you try out like 3 different characters. And my hope is that like people give a fuck enough to stick around for that. As far as like replayability, I'm like consuming 10 different forms of media right now, and like half of them are replays or rewatches. I'm all about rewatching things. And I think the reason why is because like you're a different person when you consume a piece of media again. So like you bring a new thing to it and it brings a new thing to you, and your relationship with it has shifted that way. And I think like that there's even more potential for that with games, because I mean you can just like make a new character for a D&D campaign, or the D&D can like make a new campaign for your character. There's like lots of, yeah, I guess games kind of have an extreme form of this thing with narrative that I really love.
Very cool.
I'm thinking about right now Disco Elysium in terms of like a game where the plot doesn't really change based on what path you take, but what you learn about the world can really vary based on how not only you choose to play, but also how your rolls go if you don't, save scum. Um, and just, how much fun I had playing 2 playthroughs of Disco Elysium back to back, within a very short period of time, and how I'm excited for the next one too after, a break of 6 months.
Whenever I talk to people about this game, somebody says play Disco Elysium, so I got to do it finally.
Oh, you got to
Also,
do it. It's so good.
I was also thinking of Hades when you mentioned roguelike games, Diego, which, like, yeah, I've died a billion times in that, and I played like 300 hours, so replayability is not a problem for that game.
Yeah, we actually we used Hades as a reference for Tunche. So there's a lot of it in our game. So yeah, I can see it.
All right, we have a question from Jane Noel Dreamforge, and I'm going to go ahead and assume that that's not her real name. Uh, I'm allowed to make fun of Jane. She routinely beats me at Azul. Caitlin's point of kind of setting the rules for mechanics with tabletop or live actors is very different from something programmed in a computer game. What are the differences in approach for digital versus live? Caitlin, would you like to speak to that first?
Yeah, so with live, you can have obviously you can have a specific explicit conversation about rules beforehand, which is very useful. If you, for tabletop, if you use the X card system or any number of other consent-based systems of prep of these are the things the story might touch on. Tell me if you want them gone now. Tell me if you have, any hard no's. And at any point during the game, you can tap out and no discussion needed. We change how the narrative's going. Very, very useful in horror games in particular, but I know it's got a much wider use now over the last couple of years. You also, though, and I think this is where you start getting into things that are similar to programmed things, the way that you introduce certain story elements and the way that you introduce mechanics teaches your player or your audience by example. So I'm a this isn't always true, but I tend to think that it's a good governing principle. People are more likely to think of things they've seen demonstrated than they are to think of something completely new. More likely, not always, but if you basically do a fun immersive tutorial, essentially, you sort of prime your audience or your players' decision making and imaginations to lean more towards the story you're already trying to tell. So making that a very clear and intentional tutorial and thinking of how you're going to introduce certain concepts to the game will model for your audience or your players how you are hoping they will engage with it.
Excellent. Yeah, those are some fantastic points. Tenacity, do you have thoughts on this?
Yeah, I guess with, like, say, Dungeons and Dragons, if you're like somehow finding people who've never played it before and teaching them, there's like 2 orders of narrative design there, I guess. Like, there's the original Wizards of the Coast, like, instruction manual, and they're teaching the DMs how to play the game and the player bit. And then the DM has to teach people the game, say, this is the way we're playing today, and then like design like the campaign within the larger, like, I guess, huge narrative of Dungeons and Dragons. I guess it's kind of like framing, like, out of a vast world of possibilities, like sort of just zooming in on one particular part in the possibility space that you want to be exploring in the stories. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and that reminds me of my my spouse he was doing a sandbox style D&D game, but still using D&D mechanics, but not in the way they are being used, they are commonly used. And it took several sessions of leading by example for some of the players to really pick up on it because they just wanted to default to what they were used to. And we learned, the both of us learned a lot from that of like, okay, well, how can we better communicate at the outset so that there's less of this midstream change frustration of thinking you're going to play one game and actually having to learn how to play a different game.
I would love to hear more about how that works. Also, a sandbox D&D game.
It involves a lot of very elaborate mapping, homebrew stuff of how people explore and allowing them to make maps that are wrong, but also having just kind of like what you were saying, having like set like if you find a particular location, there's a number of things that could happen in that location, and sort of keeping some of it random and then slowly as the characters, as the players build their narrative, giving them things that fit their narrative more and more as they customize it by experience.
Yeah, which is why I love the relationship aspect and playing like with like this game would be great to play with this friend, that kind of vibe.
Diego, do you have thoughts? A live game versus a computer or a digital game?
Yeah, I would actually second most of what has been told already, because I'm starting to think a lot of Dungeons and Dragons as well, and my experience with it. And yeah, it's basically you adapt the story to what the players are doing. For instance, the rules as well, but it's also like reacting to what they are doing. You might have like a story already planned, a set of rules are already mapped, but you want the game to be fun, so you actually try to adapt as much as you can to the players, to what you know they like. You actually create a story that you know that the players are going to like, because at least in my experience, I always play with friends, so I kind of know them, so I make stories for them. But in video games, it's much harder, because you don't make, at least we in my company, we don't make games for our friends, we do it for a whole bunch of people. So we have to make a story that we feel many people are going to like, but not necessarily everyone. And it's much more rigid in the rules. You can't really change much of anything, unless you make a game that actually allows for that, which I know there are. But most of the games I've worked in, they are very rigid in that sense.
Question in the chat from Mob. What game has had the best narrative design to you subjectively? And let's start with Tenacity.
Oh man. Well, Hades is my current just insane obsession in the game realm. Um, it's a roguelike, which more or less means you're trying to escape from the underworld over and over again. You're Hades's kind of petulant son, Zagreus, and you meet the Olympian gods along the way, and they give you like powers that you can use to fight the people who try to stop you from escaping the underworld, and you kind of uncover all these family secrets on the way, and it kind of repeats in a way where like familial patterns and like generational trauma repeat. And I love like the metaphor of that and like breaking free, and then like kind of like helping to like Zagreus kind of like solves a lot of the Olympians problems while he's solving his own, and sort of yeah heavy shit, and done in like this really incredibly fun and engaging way.
Diego, same question.
Yeah, I was also going to pick Hades. It's awesome. But another one I was thinking about was Horizon Zero Dawn. I haven't played the second one, but at least the first one, I think it's incredible. Their use of lore, their use of the story, the use of the mechanics in the story. I believe it's amazing. How they can how they allow players to create their own ammunition or weapons, thanks to the different enemies that they defeat. I believe that's incredible, because you can actually decide which enemies to defeat in order to make certain kinds of weapons, as well as all the story elements that you have to uncover. I don't know. I believe that game is incredible. Top five for me. And another example would be Fallout New Vegas. That game is also very good in how they deal with the missions, how they deal with the morality system, and how that affects the experience of the player, and how they choose to uh, ally themselves with a certain faction and become enemies with another, and maybe in another playthrough they can switch it up and have a whole new experience. Yeah, I would say those games.
And Caitlin, how about you?
So Disco Elysium for sure, particularly in how they decided to approach the idea of skills in that game. For those of you who haven't played, your skills kind of take the form of various voices in your head, fragments of your personality that are telling you the story the way they're perceiving it at a given time, or commenting on what's happening the way they perceive it. And and they're not always accurate. And they did this really interesting thing where if you have a very low score at something, obviously tends to be wrong when like that part of you chimes in on it. And if you have a very high score on something, it tends to be wrong because you're only seeing the world through that limited lens, and so you miss things and misinterpret things. And so it it's this really very natural way of avoiding min-maxing by players. You can still do it, but if you do it, it makes the game harder instead of easier, which I really appreciated. Also, the voice acting in that game is beautiful, and just the general world like setting design is just it's it's one of those worlds that feels completely alive from the moment you first touch it, which I always really like. Um, Honorable mentions go to Doki Doki Literature Club, which we've already talked about, and a game called Dear Esther, which is in some ways just a walking simulator. You're walking around a very, very pretty island, um, but you are also being given story largely just through voiceover, but that can trigger in a random order. And the way that it can trigger its replayability comes from it of how the story feels different when you receive different pieces of pieces of information, crucial pieces of information, but in different orders, which I just think is such a very neat, subtle experiment. And it's just the music's gorgeous, the landscape's gorgeous. I should probably replay it sometime soon. It's been years.
Okay, next question, and we are about 8 minutes left, so kind of winding things down. If someone wanted to get started in narrative design of the type that you do, how would they start? And let's go with Diego.
Well, I'm going to probably give a very traditional answer, which is uh, read a lot, write a lot, and play a lot. Um, and specifically the play part. It's important to play not just for the fun of it, but also to understand the game and to analyze it. And whenever you are making your own game, to try and see where different problems arise when dealing with a narrative, and see how other games have dealt with that problem, and what you can learn from that and apply it to your own game. So yeah, mainly play a lot. And if you make a game, try to make it like uh, I mean, do make the games that you want, but if you're making a particular game, try and look for other games like that one, so you can see what others are doing and maybe what you can do different, and or build from that.
Excellent. Caitlin, same question.
So I was very lucky in the sense that I kind of got started after having a lot of interest in it for a long time. The actual A Human project sort of fell in my lap. The guy just wanted to hire a science fiction writer and happened to call my agent and said, "Do you have anybody?" And my agent was like, "I know someone who writes fast and likes interactive, immersive theater." To which I said, "Yeah, I like going to it." And she's like, "Yeah, you could figure it out." So I just crash coursed into it and haven't done much with it since, aside from that uh, uh, choice of games project that only got to a certain extent. So so I think that playing with it in a way that is interesting to you is definitely like a way to start. If you're interested in theatrical stuff, tabletop is a pretty good place to practice that and to play with it. But in terms of actually turning it into a career of any kind, I am not sure. I do want to mention though, because fanfic has come up before, and Disco Elysium, there is at least one fanfic on itch.io called Sweeter Kind of Fire that is 18 and up only. I'm going to say that right up front. But it is an interactive fanfic in the style of the game, because the mechanics of Disco Elysium are all question based. They're all, option based. There's no reaction time or anything else like that. So the fanfic is written as if it's a part of the game, and that seems like a really cool way to play with branching narratives and programming. If you are of a fanfic persuasion already, is to do some kind of fanfic game, play with it, have fun.
Awesome. Tenacity.
I think front end, back end thinking is probably pretty useful. like you need to like have a good picture of like the system of the game in your mind, but then also it's good to remember that the player will experience it just as moments, like the present moment. So I guess kind of like, I guess planning long term and really bird's eye view and having a knack for kind of like mapping things out in like a really Game of Thrones level big kind of way, but then also like keeping it kind of snappy, like moment to moment.
Excellent. Well, we've got about 4 minutes left, so I just want to give everybody the opportunity to, if you have something that you want to plug, to go ahead and plug, or if people are curious where they can find more of your work, where would they go? Diego, can you start us off?
Yeah, sure. You can find me at Twitter. You can see my handle in my name right there, Dirole 2099. And you can find the games I've made in almost every platform. Tunche in PlayStation, Xbox, uh, Switch, and PC. The same as Arrock. Uh, it's a different difficult name, but it's ARROG. And yeah, that's pretty much it.
Thank you. Caitlin.
I am mostly on Twitter at C Starling, which is SEE_Starling. Um, like I've mentioned before, my dalliances in their design are kind of inaccessible to the larger internet because they were time limited. But I do write novels, and if you like horror sci-fi, there's The Luminous Dead. If you like gothic horror with 1800s surgery and calculus and ritual magic, there's The Death of Jane Lawrence. Um, and yeah, I hang around telling spooky stories most of the time.
Excellent. Thank you. And Tenacity.
Yeah, come yell at me on Twitter. I'll put my handle in the chat. I don't know if you can hear like the traffic outside. I live in New York. There's my Twitter handle. I've got a podcast version of a story I wrote called I Love My AI Son. It's about a marketing executive who creates an AI to model Gen Z teens and sell things to them, like with this, AI as a sounding board. And the AI just calls him cringe and tries to take down the company from the inside. So it's about kind of a parent relationship, talks about generation gaps and society. It's fun. I'll post the link on my Twitter when it's out. And hopefully my twine game will be finished and I won't die finishing it. And it'll be out also on my Twitter.
Please don't die.
Hopefully.
All right. Well, thank you to the panelists. Thank you to the attendees. There's been some fantastic questions. Feel free to keep the discussion going in the Discord. Um, I am once again Kurt Pankow. I am very Googleable. Thanks everybody, and thanks to Flight of Foundry for hosting this. So with that, we're going to sign off. So.
Really fun.